As usual with a video like this, I'd like to put out a disclaimer that this video is not a replacement for a proper clinical diagnosis. If you do feel like you are experiencing symptoms of dyspraxia, schizophrenia, even autism or ADHD, it's important that you get a proper diagnosis from a licensed medical professional. I did a lot of reading up, and I will leave a lot of sources in the description for this video, but this video is in no way a replacement for a diagnosis. I don't want anyone watching this video and then assuming they have something that they don't have. Only a truly fully licensed medical professional can properly diagnose you with something like this. Now, I've been watching some of my older content recently, partially for inspiration and also partially because I'm just a weirdo who likes to watch my own content sometimes. And I noticed that some of my favorite videos, both when I was recording them and also some of my favorite videos to watch, were my videos where I would compare dyspraxia to very similar neurodevelopmental disorders. And in many cases, these disorders also tend to be comorbid with dyspraxia. For instance, in the case of autism spectrum disorder or ADHD. However, one that I surprisingly overlooked and is actually pretty easy to overlook because of how extreme the differences are is schizophrenia. However, upon reading a little bit more about schizophrenia and the prodromal phases leading into schizophrenia, I've noticed there's a lot of similarities to dyspraxia. And after reading a couple of studies and articles, like actual scholarly articles, I started to notice that there's actually some connections between the two. All that being said, I will say that 9 times out of 10, if you're one of my fellow dyspraxics watching this video, as you watch any of my other videos, there's a good chance that you don't have schizophrenia. But at the same time, there is some evidence that there are similar genetic markers between dyspraxia and schizophrenia, and that's as far as I'm going to go in that respect, in how they're connected and how one may, play a role in the other. As it stands, even to date, there is very little knowledge as to what exactly causes schizophrenia and whether it is heritable or not. There are a lot of different causal factors that seem to tie into schizophrenia. A lot of it does seem genetic, a lot of it can be tied to diet, even based on some sources. So, there's also a few theories out there about it being tied to dopamine receptors as well, and it's just something that's hard to find an answer for. And it's unique in the way that there truly is no basis, nothing to really reliably fall back on. And this is where it is very similar to dyspraxia in that respect, because dyspraxia also has kind of an unknown origin. And especially with how recent the diagnosis of dyspraxia is, and how recent even studies correlating dyspraxia with schizophrenia, but not just that, just dyspraxia in general are, it's very hard to find a cause for dyspraxia as well. In fact, in one study I read, it was noted that many individuals who come from a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, like, say, a grandparent or a parent has schizophrenia, but the child does not end up developing schizophrenia or develops it later in life, tends to have dyspraxia to at least some degree. But what makes this confusing is the other similarity that schizophrenia has to dyspraxia, and that's that schizophrenia has what's known as a prodromal phase, which is the phase before severe typical schizophrenic symptoms happen, things like hallucinations, delusions, and so on. Now, obviously, dyspraxia doesn't specifically have a prodromal phase like schizophrenia does. But what happens in the prodromal phase in schizophrenia is very common to what dyspraxics experience. And what's unique is the prodromal phase doesn't have to be something that develops over time. It can happen suddenly or it can happen gradually over a long period of time, depending on the individual. And just like dyspraxia or ADHD or just about any other neurodevelopmental disorder, no two people with the disorder experience it the exact same way. And there typically tends to be a pattern of schizophrenia developing in the mid to late 20s, depending on age, gender, and so on. But that's not always the case, and there is schizophrenia that develops in childhood, which can also present in a similar way as dyspraxia. And why this is so confusing is that prodromal phase seems to have a lot of cognitive impairment, which is a lot like dyspraxia. That's kind of the primary thing about dyspraxia is a lack of motor control and coordination. But with dyspraxia, it's the result of the disability in planning of movements. So because the brain has trouble, planning things out ahead of time, you're basically forcing yourself to do things. Where with schizophrenia, it's more tied to a complete detachment of reality, or at least a gradual detachment of reality. With schizophrenia, there seems to be a more noted lack of desire to just do things, not because of fatigue or whatever, but just the inability to even recognize the importance of said things. And because the prodromal phase is seen very commonly throughout the childhood of someone with schizophrenia and then gets more extreme as they get older, it can mirror dyspraxia. So that's where a lot of the similarities are with schizophrenia and dyspraxia. Now, with schizophrenia, the prodromal phase leads to positive and negative symptoms. The negative symptoms do mirror dyspraxia to some degree as well, but the positive symptoms are the big definer, what separates schizophrenia from just about everything else and what is recognized as a proper diagnosis of schizophrenia. In order to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or schizophreniform disorder, and I'll talk about the differences on those a little bit, you must follow a criteria of an extended period, either episodic or prolonged, of at least two of the following. First off is hallucinations, and this is actually perceiving something that isn't there. And I say perceiving specifically because typically in the literature and in pop culture, most people assume schizophrenics always are seeing things that aren't there. When in a majority of cases, it tends to be actually hearing things that aren't there instead of seeing things that aren't there. And what's notably different between these hallucinations and, say, hallucinations from something like a psychedelic or otherwise is that it is very hard, if not impossible, to recognize said hallucination as something that doesn't truly exist in reality because it is concrete enough for someone to truly experience it as something that is real. It's not even like the little intuition voice in your head that you hear. It's actually like hearing somebody saying something to you. The other symptom is delusions, and delusions are kind of a touchy subject because even with things like ADHD in extreme manic phases as well with bipolar disorder, there are delusions to some degree, although the delusions seen in schizophrenia are a lot more extreme to the point that no matter how much evidence to the contrary of these delusions you bring the individual, it won't sway their opinion at all, even the slightest bit of doubt whatsoever. And then there is also something known as distortions of self experience, which is a very complicated term, but essentially it means that you do not believe that your own thoughts are your own, or that, you are kind of a separate actor from what is going on around you. It's basically like an extreme dissociation to some degree. And there are two more positive symptoms that are actually very similar and tend to correlate with other things that tie to dyspraxia, but it's important to note that unless you have specifically two of one of the previous three things, you do not have a proper diagnosis for schizophrenia. So trust me, you're all right. The other two are thought disorganization and disorganized speech. And I've touched a lot in my videos on how dyspraxia affects one's memory and how they think, as well as how it affects our speech. However, it's important to note that while our speech can be disjointed to some degree, we can still maintain full sentences. The disorganized speech seen in the positive symptoms of schizophrenia tend to come out in a lot more of a jumbled way, where, taking one specific word and going from that word to a completely different word to a completely different word to the point that even just one sentence doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Even when us dyspraxics tend to ramble on from topic to topic to some degree, it's still fully coherent enough and understandable enough that it's basically just like clicking on multiple Wikipedia articles as you hit the blue link as it interests you, essentially, as opposed to the disorganized thoughts and speech of schizophrenia, where it's literally like hitting the recommended button on your phone when you're texting and then just sending whatever it puts out. Sometimes it makes sense, but for the most part, it usually doesn't. And while in some cases the positive symptoms of schizophrenia are prolonged to the point of going on throughout the individual's life without any stopping, typically in most cases schizophrenia is episodic. And so in between phases of positive symptoms, there tends to be negative symptoms, although the negative symptoms are also present in phases of the psychotic symptoms. One of the most notable negative symptoms of schizophrenia is flat affect, or having a completely blank slate reaction to just about everything. And while I've noticed not just me, but a lot of other dyspraxics tend to be relatively deadpan when it comes to talking, and without a super amount of inflection, there still is some emotion injected, as opposed to with a proper flat affect in the respect of schizophrenia, it's almost no stimulus whatsoever to a reaction of any sort of thing going on. And it doesn't even have to be within speech or conversation. It could be something absurd going on, like, say, across the street. Some crazy event is happening, like a bunch of clowns running down the street or whatever, and a schizophrenic will not react whatsoever to that. But there is also what's known as anhedonia, which is the lack of desire to do anything for fun or otherwise. It's just a lack of interest, which is commonly seen in things like depression and anxiety. And that's the important thing to note, is even with the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia, while there's a lot of parallels between that and dyspraxia as well, there's also a lot of similarities between those and depression and anxiety and also bipolar disorder. And what's interesting is schizophrenia is labeled as what's known as a psychotic disorder, in that it is noted for having symptoms of what's typically known as psychosis. Psychosis, in a basic way of putting it, is essentially the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, just for however amount of time. So, with bipolar disorder, especially in extremely intense manic states, one can experience delusions and hallucinations very similar to one with schizophrenia, although typically it's the result of a mental break, and therefore it doesn't last a prolonged period of time. Also, as you guys know, of course, I'm going to mention drugs. Many drugs, including stimulants and obviously psychedelics, are capable of, at extreme doses or overdoses, capable of presenting psychotic symptoms. Especially stimulants, there's something known specifically as stimulant psychosis, when one consumes way too much of a stimulant regularly, it can create stimulant psychosis. But what separates this from something like schizophrenia is obviously once you get off the drug, in most cases, the positive symptoms tend to go away. Now, like I've mentioned in previous videos, these things, drugs as well as bipolar disorder, can be a stressor that can lead to schizophrenia. So there are many cases where an individual with, say, a predisposition to schizophrenia does something like methamphetamine or even psilocybin, and then has a mental break or way too intense an experience, and it causes an early onset of schizophrenia, and they just never come back. But it is important to note that not only is that rare, but it also really only happens in individuals who do have a prior history of schizophrenia, be it in a family or otherwise. I guess that's another very interesting comparison between dyspraxia and schizophrenia, is not only the proneness to anxiety and mental breaks when put through an extreme scenario like heavy drug use, but also the fact that there is such a genetic component to it. And in fact, in a study, and that's going to be the first link in the description, I read a study where they talked about the descendants of individuals who were already diagnosed with schizophrenia. And in many cases, those descendants may or may not have experienced schizophrenia later on in life, but a vast majority of them still had symptoms similar to the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia, almost mirroring dyspraxia. Now, keep in mind this is a scholarly article from, I believe, 2003 or 2008. There's a couple of them I'm referencing, but they're all from the early 2000s. And even in the early 2000s, there was a very poor understanding of dyspraxia to that point, even. And they will note that, there are flaws in just about every scholarly article and study, and that's why you usually have to do multiple studies before fully confirming a hypothesis. But it is very interesting and may give some idea of what actually causes dyspraxia to some degree. Maybe not for everyone, but it's an interesting avenue to look through. And I hope that if there's any neurologist or scientist or those in the Our Dyspraxia Discord, I know they were doing a lot of studies and stuff there, that might be a key to look into to maybe try to understand where dyspraxia comes from. But at that same respect, even if dyspraxia is tied to schizophrenia, even with how much literature we have on schizophrenia, there's still a numerous amount of theories as to what exactly causes schizophrenia, let alone dyspraxia. So it's not a complete picture. There's no conclusions to be drawn specifically from this, at least at this time, but it's interesting and it's something to go off of. So, yeah. But, yeah, that's all for this one, everyone. This video was a bit rambly and probably a little preachy because I'm really backing it off of a lot of articles. Usually I do my research and I'll scan over things, but this was a topic that really interested me for some reason. It was super interesting, just learning about schizophrenia in general. It's a very interesting topic, and I would heavily suggest looking into it for those who are interested in things like psychiatry and psychology. But part of why I was looking into it is because I am doing a similar video on dyspraxia as it relates to things like personality disorders. And two of those personality disorders are schizoid and schizotypal personality disorders, which are actually significantly different from schizophrenia. They have a lot of similarities, but they aren't exactly the same thing. So, I mean, they're personality disorders, while schizophrenia is a full-blown mental disorder. So, they're even two completely different types of disorder. But in reading about these things, I kind of went down a rabbit hole and learned about schizophrenia. And upon reading about schizophrenia, I noticed a lot of similarities between schizophrenia and dyspraxia. So, it's also important to note I don't have a lot of personal experience with schizophrenia. I don't know anyone who has it personally. And almost everything I read was from either arguments on the internet or proper scholarly articles. So even things like the connection between dyspraxia and schizophrenia are really up in the air. But I tried to do as well informed a video as possible. And if you're watching this and say you have schizophrenia or know someone with schizophrenia and have some input, feel free to leave that in the comments. I definitely like reading the comments, and I'll definitely reference it if I ever do a follow-up video that includes this topic, because I definitely want to go back and touch on this topic again. Schizophrenia is really interesting. Yeah, that's all for this one, everyone. Thanks for watching. We're 230 something strong. I'm still getting comments and new ads. It's crazy. You guys are awesome. I never expected to get this much like followers on YouTube. That wasn't my intent to begin with, but I appreciate every single one of you. I hope you guys are having a good summer, and you guys have a good one.